Good morning, everyone. Yeah, it's almost summer. We're a little more than a month away from the longest day of the year. I didn't mean that to be discouraging. I just notice it by 5 o'clock in the morning, it's light out. You can see, and it's still light. You can still see out in the backyard at 9 at night. The days are getting longer. And after that rain we had, it's going to get to 70 degrees. If the sun comes out here in the next couple days, you watch the world just explode. It is going to just explode with growth. It's fun. It's a fun time of year. We are walking through the book of Genesis. If you haven't been here for a while, or if you're new here, we have been working our way through the book of Genesis for some time. We'll take a chunk of it, we'll walk through it slowly, then we'll take a break and move on to a different series of messages about something else, but then we'll come back. And so we're slowly working our way through Genesis. Today we're finishing up a story in Genesis. It's Genesis chapter 19, and it's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. We've spent a lot of time on that here. We're finishing it up today. This is the very last of it. And so this idea of Sodom and Gomorrah, as we get into this last section, we're seeing the lingering effects of Sodom and Gomorrah. And really what we're talking about is Lot and his daughters. Lot is one of the central characters. He was the nephew of Abraham. And so we're seeing what happened to Lot here in this town of Sodom, kind of what happened to him and his family. Now we're finishing up the story. God has dealt with Sodom and Gomorrah, but now we're seeing how it impacted Lot and his family. And so we're going to end today with this story, kind of last little story of Lot and his daughters. Can you give me that first slide there, Josiah? We're seeing the residual impact of it. You know, Sodom was this evil city. God saw it. He judged it. He disciplined it. He destroyed it. And now that's done. That looking at Sodom, judging what they did, dealing with their sin, that's all done. But we see that there is lingering effects still. There is residual impact, and it's impacting people. And so that's what we're looking at today, is how that whole thing of Sodom, what God did there, and how Lot was impacted by it, and not just Lot, but his family. This is a sad story, this little 9 verses we're going to read. It's a sad story. If you think about it at all, it's a shocking story. What happens here is not pretty. It's shocking. It's in some ways disgusting. This is not a clean, happy story. And sometimes the Bible has those, and so we look at them. But again, remember, as we walk through this, we've said from the beginning, this book was written to instruct you and I. This book was written so that God could speak to you and I. And we see what happened to people in the world so that we can know how we can live well in the world. We see how people interacted with God then, so we can learn how to interact with God now. This is instructive to us. So as we read this sad, shocking story, remember, we're not reading it it's not just, ooh, wow, this is not the National Enquirer. This is to instruct us. This is to instruct you and I. Just a quick warning to parents. I don't know, we're going to read this. There is behavior here that is described that is not pretty. So, Mom and Dad, I don't know if there are kids in here that you would like to I guess just be aware. We're not going to dwell on it. We're not going to get into great gory detail, but we are going to read the story, and it's not a pretty story, okay? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to read here in Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 to 38. And again, this is just the very tail end of the story, just to catch us up on the story. Lot was Abraham's nephew. Many years prior to this story, Lot had moved to the town of Sodom. He'd looked around and chosen for himself the place in the world where he thought he could do best financially. He chose for himself. He went to this place. The problem was Sodom was a terribly evil place. They were disobeying the Lord mightily, so much so that God had seen it and was coming to judge that city. In fact, not just that city, but all the cities around it as well. It had become an evil place. That's the best way to describe it. It had become an evil place, and Lot had chosen that, and Lot had lived in this evil place for many, many years. He'd raised his family there in this bad place, and now God is coming to execute judgment on this evil. And God did. He came there. He sent angels. The angels warned Lot for Abraham's sake, Lot, get out of this city because we're going to destroy it. Lot resisted. He struggled. We saw a terrible, another shocking story where the men of the city came and wanted to rape the angels. Lot, he knew that was bad, so instead he offered his daughters to this town to rape them. It was just completely unseemly and completely bad in 1,000 different ways. None of that had happened. Lot and his family left. God rained fire down and burned the city of Sodom. Now we're seeing the end of that story, what happens to Lot after that. So I'm going to start reading in verse 30. Lot and his 2 daughters left Zoar. That was a little town that Lot had fled to. Left Zoar and settled in the mountains, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. He and his 2 daughters lived in a cave. One day the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to lie with us, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine and then lie with him and preserve our family line through our father." That night, they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and lay with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down and when she got up. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I lay with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and lie with him, so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went and lay with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites today. All right. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to break that story down just a little bit. I'm going to give some observations, some things that I see, and then we're going to spend most of our time asking the question, what can we learn from this? Because again, God wants to instruct us. So we'll start with just some observations here in this story, and then we'll get to some lessons that I see. As we do this, remember, I would encourage you to read this yourself and let God give you observations. Yours might be different than mine. God wants to speak to you through this, so take this home. Oh, I forgot to say there are those sheets in the back. If you didn't get one, the study guides that go along with this, you can grab one. If you get up now and get one, that's great. Otherwise, you can grab one on the way out. So just a couple of observations that I see here in this. First, in verse 30, it said that Lot left Zoar. And that's interesting because if you remember the story, he had wanted to go there. God had said to him, go to the mountains because I'm going to destroy every city on the plain, including Zoar. Zoar was one of the cities that God was going to destroy. And Lot said, no, please I don't want to go to the mountains. Let me go to this little city. Somehow if it was little, maybe it was better, but God let him go there. But now it says he's leaving there. And it says the reason he's leaving is because he's afraid. He was afraid to stay in Zoar. And it's just curious to me when I read that, it doesn't tell us what he was afraid of. And I've wondered about that. Maybe he was afraid that God was going to destroy Zoar like he destroyed Sodom. Because initially that seems to be what God was going to do. Zoar was slated for destruction because they were just as evil as Sodom. And it's very possible that Lot got to Zoar and looked around and thought, this is just the same as the place I left. And God burned that up. If I stay here, I'm in trouble. Perhaps that's why he was afraid. Maybe he was afraid of the people. It's possible that the people of Zoar looked around and said, holy smokes, no pun intended. Look, that he burned Sodom to the ground. He burned all these cities to the ground, and Lot, you came from there. And somehow maybe Lot thought, these people are looking at me kind of sideways. These people might blame me for this. Maybe he was afraid of the people. I don't know. All we know is that we see that Lot was afraid. So he does what God told him to do earlier. At the very beginning, God had said, go to the mountains. Lot had said, no, I can't go there. I'm going to die, he'd said. I'm going to die if I go to the mountains. Well, now that's where he's going. He's going to the mountains because he's afraid here. Another thing that it doesn't say here that is interesting to me is, why didn't Lot go back to Abraham? If you remember back in the story, Lot had been living with Abraham. For the first part of Genesis was Abraham and Lot moving together. Lot was Abraham's nephew. He'd come with Abraham back from where Abraham had come from. He had moved into this part of the world with Abraham, and then they'd separated. It's curious to me why now, at Lot's greatest moment of need, he didn't go back to Abraham. The reason he left Abraham in the first place, do you remember why? It's because, well, Abraham had all these cattle and sheep, and Lot had all these cattle and sheep, and the land wasn't big enough for all of their cattle and sheep. Well, what's true about Lot now? He ain't got no cattle. He got nothing. That reason for separating is gone, and I wonder why he didn't go back home. Might have been pride, perhaps. When he left, he was somebody. When he left, he could look at himself and say, I'm an important person in the world. And now at the end of his life, and we looked at this last week, one decision after the next, Lot had trapped himself in a corner where he lost everything. And it was his fault. It was his decisions, one after the next. Maybe he just was proud and didn't want to go back to Abraham. We don't know. But he didn't go. But we see here a man, I think, who is not functioning well. I think Lot, we said this last week, Lot lost everything. He lost his possessions, he lost his wife, he lost his home, he lost his living, his means of making a living, he lost his prestige. And he's losing his dignity. He's living in a cave. He's afraid. He's hiding. He has really come to the end of his rope, and it's going to get a little bit worse here in a minute. Because not only did Lot lose everything, but his daughters did as well. Lot's daughters lost as much as Lot did. They were all that they had been giving their life to was gone as well. They're living in the cave with him. So Lot lost everything. But now that takes us to Lot's daughters, and that's really what this passage is about. Most of this passage deals with Lot's daughters, and it deals with, I think, their moral compass. In other words, their understanding of what was right and wrong, and their understanding of how they should live in the world. And we see something about them here. We see something about Lot's daughters' moral compass, how they think, they should act, what they think is right and wrong. And what they did here was they slept with their father. They chose on purpose to manipulate things so that each one of them would have sex with their father. And they did it on purpose. And we see here the thinking of the daughters. And there were two very specific reasons why they thought this is the thing that we should do. And the first one, the older daughter says what? We're in this place and there's no man to lie with us, as is the custom over all the earth. In other words, the older daughter looked around and said, we're supposed to be having sex. There's no man here to lie with us, as is the custom over the whole earth. And I think what I see here is that these girls were viewing sex through the eyes of Sodom. Remember what was going on back there? Sex was not what God had intended. God instituted Making love. This was something God created. And he told Adam and Eve, I want you to do this. I want you to have children together. But you do it in the confines of this marriage where a man will leave his father and mother, be united to his wife, and the two of you become one flesh. There is this beautiful intimacy between a man and a woman and a commitment, a spiritual, emotional, relational commitment that is consummated by this physical commitment with each other. God had created sex to be this beautiful thing, but the people of Sodom and Gomorrah and much of the world had perverted it and turned it into something absolutely different than what God had intended. And I think the girls were seeing sex not through the eyes of God, the way he intended it, by what they'd seen around them. Sex is something, because think of what had happened. Think of what those girls had seen. Their whole life, they'd watched this evil transpiring. The night they left Sodom, the entire town came and demanded to rape the two men who had come to Lot. Lot told the girls, I'm going to send you out there to get raped by them instead. They did not have a good picture of sex, I don't think. It was twisted. They were seeing this thing through the eyes not of God, but through the eyes of Sodom. Well, we're supposed to sleep with people. There ain't anybody here. Guess we'll sleep with Dad. There's something very ugly and wrong about that, but that's what happened. And that's one of the reasons the older daughter said, this is a good idea. We should do this. There's another one. There's another reason given, and she says to her younger daughter, let's sleep with Dad so that we can preserve our family line. In other words, she intended to have children through this. She intended to have kids so that the family line could keep on going. Now this is actually something that God speaks about. And in Deuteronomy, I don't think I have this verse on the screen, but in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 and 6, this is later, but in the law of Moses, when God is telling the Israelites how they should conduct themselves in all these kinds of different ways. It's interesting here in verse 5 and 6. He says, if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her, and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. There's something about this idea of carrying on the family line, which was in God's mind, which is a good thing. We see that. So there was something about what the older daughter said that wasn't just completely twisted and wrong and bad, but what's the problem? God had a way for that to happen. And they're trying to achieve God's purposes their own way, in a way that makes sense to them. The older daughter, okay, it's good for us to preserve our family line, but it's up to us to figure out how to do that. We're going to do it in a way that makes sense to us. The way that they chose to do it was not the way God had chosen to do it. They tried to do what could have been a good thing, but by not doing it the way God intended, it turned into a bad thing. We just see their moral compass is messed up. They don't know right from wrong. They don't know how to do what's right. Even if they do know what it's right, they don't know how to get there. These girls have just come to a point in their life where they're unable, I think, to really have a moral compass. They don't know what's right and wrong. They don't know what to do. And so they do this. They sleep with their dad, they get him drunk, sleep with him, they both get pregnant. Just one little aside here to kind of end the story of Lot. As I think about this, I wonder how drunk he was. And I think this might have been the last indignity for this man. His life had spiraled down to the desperately ugly point of he is so dejected, so given up on himself and the world, that he's sleeping on the floor in a cave, drunk, so drunk he doesn't know he's having sex with his children. This is the last indignity. And Lot disappears after this story. We never see Lot again. Don't know what happened to him. I suspect he died there in that cave. But I don't know that. Last observation I see here, just quickly, is the last few verses. It says, so both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son. She named him Moab. The younger daughter had a son. She named him Ben-Ami, and he was the father of the Ammonites. Moab was the father of the Moabites. Moab and Ammon are countries that show up in the later on in the story of Genesis. And there's a map here. You can see there's Israel and Judah, and you see the purple one there is Moab, the kingdom of Moab, and the kind of, I don't know if that's yellow or orange or what color that is. The kingdom of Ammon. These are, so Moab, one of Lot's daughter's sons, became a nation, the kingdom of Moab. Ben-Ami, the other daughter's son, became a nation as well, the kingdom of Ammon. And God speaks about them later on. It's interesting in Deuteronomy chapter 2, when we see the story of the Israelites leaving Egypt and going to the promised land, they passed through those two countries. They passed through the country of Moab and they passed through the country of Ammon. And God speaks to the Israelites about those two countries. In chapter Deuteronomy 2:9, he says, "Then the Lord said to me, do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war, for I will not give you any part of their land. I have given Ar," that's Moab, "to the descendants of Lot as a possession." Interesting. Years later, God is saying, okay, this nation, it's theirs because they're descendants of Lot, and I'm giving it to them. He said the same thing about Ammon in verse 19. He says basically the exact same thing. When you come to the Ammonites, do not harass them or provoke them to war, for I will not give you possession of any of the land belonging to the Ammonites. I have given it as a possession to the descendants of Lot. I think I see here God's grace to Abraham still. You remember last week? God said, I'm going to rescue Lot, Abraham, because you are righteous. I think that's what I see here. I think I see God choosing to be gracious to Lot's descendants for Abraham's sake. But regardless, we do see that these two boys grew into nations that God recognized and God protected years later. All right. Let's shift gears and let's say, what can we learn from this sad and shocking story? And I do think that there are lessons here. And I would say this again, I would encourage you to chew on this and think on this, because there's more lessons than what I'm going to say here. I'm going to lay out one that I think is very good and very clear, but there are more, and I would encourage you to think about it yourself. But here's the one that I want to talk about for just a little while. And it's a lesson having to do with calibrating your kid's moral compass. I had said that Lot's daughter's moral compass was messed up. And I think a lot of that had to do with their parents, probably particularly with Lot. And so there's a lesson there, I think, for us as parents, as grandparents, as people who are interacting with kids. How can we help the kids around us, the kids in our homes, the kids in our families, how can we help them to calibrate their moral compasses so they don't end up in the situation like Lot's daughters? And so I want to think about that. And I like the picture of a compass. Compass is something that does what? It gives you perspective. It helps you know which way is which. Which way is north, which way is south, which way is east, which way is west. I have a compass here. I spent a lot of time as a boy learning how to use a compass. My dad taught me how to use a compass because we would spend a lot of time in the woods. And I would follow my dad through the woods. And we spent time in woods that for me as a 8, 9, 10-year-old boy might as well have been as big as Africa, because from the place where we left the road until the place where you hit the next road, if you walked in a straight line, it was about 16 miles. Now, 16 miles is not that far now, but when you're 8, that's like going to the North Pole and back or something like that. So Dad taught me how to use a compass because I was out in the woods and I needed to know which way is which. And so I spent a lot of time, and Dad would always ask me, "Where's your compass?" When we're out in the woods, "Where's your compass?" And I had to take it in my pocket and show it to him. And then when my kids started following us around, he'd ask my kids, "Where's your compass?" They'd have to take their compass out and show it to him. And a compass is great because when you get all twisted around and you don't know which way is which, you pull out your compass and, oh, that way is north. There it is. It's pointing that way, and that's north. And that's true. That's north. Okay, good. But if you're using a compass, it gives you perspective, but there's one more thing you need, isn't there? Before you can really begin to get a benefit out of a compass, what else do you need? A starting point, but even more than that. Where are you going? If the compass always pointed home, that would be a really good compass. Or like Johnny Depp in Pirates of the Caribbean, the compass that points to where your heart really wants to go. I mean, wouldn't that be a great thing? That's not how compasses work. They point north whether you want to go there or not. They're just pointing north. So for a compass to be any good, for a compass to be useful, you have to have a map. You have to know where you are and where you're going. So my dad gave me a map, and he made me study it. This isn't, I had a couple of these. This is the only one I could find. But this is a plat map of the land where my dad and I would go, and the woods. And he would write on here, okay, here's the road where we'd park the truck. Okay, you can see the river running right through here. And he would draw on here, here's the logging roads. This logging road goes this way, and then it turns and goes this way. And he would write on here little landmarks. Here's the old horse barn that is falling down that a guy 100 years ago had been logging out here, and he'd built a barn. It's right here, and you know what that looks like. Okay, so when you get there, you know where it's at. Here's the logging road that goes straight through. It's an old railroad grade. He made me study the map so that I knew where the roads were. I knew where the landmarks were. I knew where the river was. I knew where the High Line crossed through the woods. So that when I was out in the woods and I ran into a landmark, then okay, I have some perspective. Now I can pull out my compass and I can look and see from this point the truck is east. Which way is east? Okay, there we go. So Dad taught me how to use a compass, and he taught me how to use a map so that I could navigate a woods that was sometimes dark, that was sometimes confusing. Those woods were filled with swamps up there in the northern part of the state. Lots of swamps, lots of cliffs, lots of things that would get you twisted and turned around. Dad gave me a map. Dad gave me a compass so that I could learn how to navigate. Here's how this applies. God has a course for your kids. If we're thinking about your kids, God has a course for your kids. There's some place where they're starting, and there's some place He wants them to get. I love this verse in 2 Timothy because it's such a big picture help for us to know, you know what, I have a place to go. Paul, this is written by a guy named Paul, and at the end of his life, he said, I've fought the good fight. I've finished the course. I've kept the faith. I've finished the course. I like that, meaning there was a course. I started here, and I followed a path, and I finished. I've kept the faith. I got to where I wanted to go. God looks at you. God looks at your kids. God looks at your grandkids. And He says, you're the same as Paul. You're starting here, but I have a course for you to run. I have a path for you to follow. There are things to do along the way, and I can help you to get from where you are to where you're going. And it is such a good thing for us to remember my life is not just my own to do with what I please. I can make so many choices, but God says, you know what? I have laid out a course for you, a course that's good. A course that will take you to where you really want to go, and I can show you what it is, but are you going to follow that course or not? God has a course for you and your kids, but the kids, you and the kids around you need to navigate that course in a world that makes it difficult. The world that we live in wants to trip us up. It wants to trap us. It wants to tempt us into going the wrong direction. That is absolutely the truth, folks. And if you don't think it's true, life is going to be difficult for you. There is a good course for you to walk, but the world wants to get you off it. That's one of the truths of the Bible, I think. The world wants to trip you, trap you, and tempt you. It wants to take you into a swamp and sink you up to your neck where you can't get out. Wants to get you walking in a circle until it's so dark you don't know where you are anymore. Doesn't want you to get to the end of that course that God has laid out for you. So, how do we help our kids navigate that world? Lot didn't help his daughters. He just didn't help them. How do we help the kids in our life navigate? Well, there's a lot in there. I want to give some thoughts on that. This is particularly to parents, perhaps grandparents. I think all of us can put ourselves in this situation, but I'm speaking specifically to those who are helping kids navigate, helping kids learn to kind of establish their own moral compass. And the first part of it, I think, is you need to give them a map. You need to help them see the lay of the land. That's the first thing you need to do. If you want your kids to make good decisions in life, if you want your kids to understand this is right and this is wrong, and I'm going to choose this in this specific situation, like Lot's daughters were in a situation to choose and they chose poorly. Well, if you want to choose well, the first thing you have to do is know where am I and where am I going? What's the goal here? What's the map? What's the lay of the land? And in general terms, I want to say two things when it specifically comes to helping our kids navigate this world well. Helping our kids develop a good moral compass. And the first thing is this: Christians, your kids, all Christians, if they're going to do this well, they need to engage. They need to engage in the world. This verse in Matthew, we think about this a lot. At the end of Jesus' life, just before he left, he says to the very first Christians, the forefathers of the church, of all of us, of this family of Christ, he says to them, go out into the world and make disciples of all the nations. In other words, don't just stay here, go out. Make disciples of all the nations. Get out and get out into the world. You have to engage in the world. In the book of Acts, just a little while later, in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, it says, "And you," this is Jesus again speaking to those guys, "you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem," that's here, that's where they were, in Judea and Samaria, that's kind of the surrounding areas, and to the ends of the earth. In other words, you need to kind of get out into the world. You need to get out, not just stay close, not just stay behind the walls. And he's actually saying this to men who at the time were inclined to hide because the world that they lived in had just crucified Jesus. The world that they lived in looked extremely scary, extremely dangerous, extremely confusing and dark, and they were inclined to just, let's go behind doors and hide. And Jesus is saying, no, that's not what I want you to do. You need to open the door, you need to get out, you have to engage in the world. And you engage for a specific reason. He says there, you're going to be my witnesses. And in 1 Corinthians 9, Paul, a guy who really took that and kind of put feet to it for all of us, is saying this. He's saying here in this passage, I'm doing that. I'm going out into the world and I'm telling people about Jesus. And I'm doing it in a certain way. He says, this is the passage, if you're familiar, it says, I become all things to all men. In other words, what he's saying is, I'm going out into the world and I want them to understand that Jesus is real. I want to tell them, but I need to recognize that they don't think like me, and so I have to go and in some ways think like them. I have to give them a reason to listen to me. And he says, to those not having the law, I become like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but I'm under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. In other words, you go out into the world specifically to talk to them about Christ. It's really maybe summed up best in this next verse. It's in 2 Corinthians 5. This is worth camping on just a little bit. 2 Corinthians 5. I like this picture that Paul uses here to talk about this. And he's talking about this very thing, going out and talking to people in the world about God. And starting with verse 18 here in chapter 5, it says, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ, and gave us the ministry of reconciliation. In other words, a ministry is a job, an activity. This is what I'm doing. This is the service I'm giving to the world. I have this ministry. It's a ministry of reconciliation, that God was reconciling the world to himself in Christ, not counting men's sins against them. And he has committed to us this message of reconciliation. We are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. And I like that picture of an ambassador. Because what does an ambassador do? Does an ambassador stay in his home country? No. An ambassador goes to the country to whom he is ambassading. That's not an accurate word. He goes to that country representing his home country. I think that's the picture here. Christians, we are asked to be ministers of the gospel of reconciliation to the world. What that means is we have to engage with the world. You can't just go and hide behind closed doors. You can't just stay in the truck because the woods are scary. You got to get out into the woods. Christians need to engage. But here's the balance to that. Christians need to resist. Christians need to resist the world. We talk about that. I think about this verse a lot. Do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world. We cannot become like the world around us, and we are prone to do it. Do not conform to the pattern of this world. Why? Well, in 1 Peter 4:3, it tells us you've spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans choose to do, and then this verse goes on to list a litany of disgusting things that the world just does, just like Sodom and Gomorrah. He says, look, you don't want to live that way. As you go out into the world, okay, you need to engage it, but you can't become like it. You have to set yourself apart. Why? Because what they're doing is not good. What they're doing is bad. It's harmful to you. It's dishonoring to God. We cannot just, it doesn't matter what we do. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. In 2 Timothy 2:22, this is a verse I thought of a lot as a young man, as a college student. Flee the evil desires of youth. and I didn't think about it at the time, but it's almost like when you're young and you don't know a lot, if you want to do something, just run the other way. That's not really what it means. But the point is this: we have these desires that really pull us, don't they? Oh, it just seems so interesting to look at that website. Oh, and everything in me wants to look. Oh, it seems so good to talk about that person with their neighbor and just to run them down. Oh, it's something in me longs to do that. There's a pull, unfortunately. We don't have to go out into the world to feel that pull. It's inside of us, and we have to resist it. Flee the evil desires of youth, and do what? Pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. With who? The world? No, along with those who call on the name of the Lord out of a pure heart. We are told, listen, you better get close with other people who are doing this. Otherwise, you're going to become like the world. So as we're engaging, we don't just throw ourselves headlong like Lot did. Throw yourself headlong. I'm just going to do and be everything the world is. No, I'm different. And I like this last verse because it kind of ties into that ambassador thing. 1 Peter 2:11. It says, dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. You are an alien in this world. You're an ambassador to it, but you don't belong here. Right? An ambassador doesn't become a citizen of the country he or she is going to. They're still a citizen of back home. Someday they're going home. Their allegiances, their loyalties lie back home, not with the country that they are at. Your allegiance, your home is not here. It is not here. This is not who you owe your allegiance to. We are aliens and strangers in this world. My citizenship is somewhere else. I'm an ambassador here, so I need to engage. But I'm an alien. I'm a stranger here. Someday I'm going home. I will resist becoming like this. That's the big picture lay of the land that we need to let our kids understand. You need to engage the world because you're given a mission, a ministry to reconcile. But you cannot become like the world. You have to resist the world. You're an ambassador, but you don't belong here. You're an ambassador, but you don't belong here. So, with that, map, with that road map, and I realize that's very general and there's much more to it, but with that general road map, thinking about navigating the world, I need to engage it so I can be an ambassador, but I have to resist it because I'm not a citizen. How do we help our kids kind of do that? How do we help them to calibrate their moral compass so when they remember, I'm in the world, but I'm going home, I'm here for a purpose, and they think about how do I make decisions with that? How do we help them calibrate their moral compass so they can make wise decisions in the moment? I have some tips for you. 3 tips. 3 tips that you can use to help your kids engage in the world and not conform. And again, there are more. You can take these for what they're worth. Here's the first one. And I'm speaking to moms and dads primarily here, and I would even back up a little farther and say, dads, if you're not doing this, this is your primary role. Dads, you had better be about this because this is your primary role. But moms and dads together, and grandparents, I'm a grandparent now. I have a 2-year-old grandson, and I have a granddaughter who's T-minus 2 weeks. So I think about this with them as well. Instruct them in the difference between God and the world. You have to instruct them in the difference between God and the world. You have to tell them the world is this and God is something different. You have to instruct them. Fathers, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord, and it's different than the world. Lot didn't do that. Lot didn't tell his girls, you know what, this stuff you're seeing around you, that's not what God designed. Apparently, he didn't tell them that because they never picked it up. They had no idea. They just thought that sex was what they'd seen all the time. They didn't know that God had a different plan for it. You, mom and dad, have to instruct your kids. Here's what God says. Here's what the world says. Here's what the world does, but that's not what God wants us to do. There is a difference. There is a difference, and they have to be told. You do that through, you know the answer to this. What's the answer? This. Right here. Oh, I love this thing. I love this thing. Psalm 105, or Psalm 119, 105, your word, this book, is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. You ever been lost in the woods at dark? There is nothing like a light. Even if you know where the logging road is, if you can't see it, you're in trouble. Oh, light is a wonderful thing. Mom and dad, hold up God's word next to what your kids are seeing in the world. You want to do a great thing? Take commercials that you see while, I don't know if anyone watches TV anymore. Commercials are actually instructive. They're annoying as heck. But in this context, they can be instructive because commercials speak to what the world says is important. This thing is important. This look is important. This attitude is important. These are the people and the things that you should emulate and want. Commercials tell us there are people who get really smart people who get paid millions of dollars to know what the world wants and then to put it in commercials. You want to learn about the world? Watch commercials. You want to teach your kids the difference? Watch a commercial with them and then say, well, what does God say about that? And you can have a very stark contrast. This is what the world's saying. This is what this commercial is saying. Here's what God says instead. Mom and dad, you have to do that. You have to instruct your kids. One of the great mistakes I made as a parent was I just assumed my kids would pick it up. I wasn't intentional enough in doing what I just said you should do. I made that mistake. Looking back on it, I realized it was a mistake. Mom and dad, instruct your kids. Bring them up in the training and discipline of the Lord. Read the Word. Here's the second tip and the second thing you have to do, and this is very important, is that you have to model what you desire in them. In other words, you have to calibrate your own compass. You have to calibrate your own compass and follow it. Because if you don't, your kids aren't going to pay any attention to you. In Deuteronomy, back in Deuteronomy chapter 6, is an interesting verse. This is what God says. These are the commands, decrees, and laws the Lord your God directed me to teach to you. Now, Moses is speaking to adults here. God told Moses to teach these commands and decrees and laws to the people. Teach them to you to observe in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to possess, so that you, your children, and their children after them may fear the Lord your God as long as you live. In other words, Moses is saying to the adults, here's what God says. You need to observe it. You need to follow it. Why? Because that's going to influence your kids, not just your generation. If you do what's right, it influences the next generation and the generation after that. Mom and Dad, if you want, it's good to instruct your kids, but then you have to be instructed yourself. Your moral compass has to be calibrated, and you have to be following it. Otherwise, your kids are going to get mixed up. That verse in Ephesians 6 that we saw the last half. It says, fathers, bring your children up in the training and instruction of the Lord. But here's what the first part of that verse says. It says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Is that the next slide? Yeah, do not exasperate your children. In other words, train them, but don't exasperate them. I think one of the most powerful ways you can exasperate your kids is to tell them one thing and do another. Because it's confusing and it's frustrating. And it's maddening for them. So Mom and Dad, you have to believe your own compass. My dad taught me to read a compass, and I spent a lot of time following my compass through the woods. When my oldest daughter was old enough to follow me in the woods, I would teach her how to read a compass. But she reminds me that once in a while I would do this. We'd be somewhere, and I'd been in those woods now at this point for 40 years. I knew those woods like the back of my hand. I was pretty sure. And I would get to a place, and Becca would know we're supposed to go west. And she would look at her compass and say, Dad, that's west. And I'd look at it and look around and say, no, it ain't. No, that's not right. That's not right. It's this way, honey. And but it says that's west. Yeah, I know, but we're going to go this way. 300 yards later, I'm looking around and thinking, okay, you were right. That was west. Mom and Dad, you have to believe your own compass. And you have to let your kids, here's another thing. You're going to make mistakes. Mom and Dad, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to get fooled. You and I are not above getting tricked and trapped and tempted by the world. There was a hill out in the woods where Dad and I hunted, and he showed this to me. He'd tell me to pull out your compass and just keep it out, and we would walk toward this hill. And north would be this way, and we'd be walking west. The closer we got to the hill, the compass would be swinging and swinging and swinging to the point where we got to the base of the hill. Now the compass was pointing straight west. And you'd walk over the hill, it'd stay that way, get to the bottom of the hill and start walking away, and the compass would swing back to the north. There was something in that hill. It was filled with iron or something, I don't know, but it messed up the compass. Really, it turned the compass the wrong way. I would watch the compass swing back again. The world will do that to you. When that happens, be willing to admit, you know what, I need help here. I got to course correct. Let your kids see you course correct. I've been trying to go this way, and the truth is, I took us into a swamp. I'm sorry, let's get out of here. That's okay. That's okay. You're going to walk into a swamp. You're going to get fooled. You're going to run into a hill that makes your compass go all silly. That's okay. Course correct. Let your kids do it. Because, Mom and Dad, I think that hypocrisy, and particularly hypocrisy from you, is more dangerous to your kids than the unbelieving world. I think it is. I think the unbelieving world will mess your kids up, but not as much as you will if you're a hypocrite. I say that for different reasons. I think that's what happened to Lot. We looked at Lot in 2 Peter. Justin talked about this, where it says that Lot was a righteous man and his soul was tormented by what he saw, but he didn't ever do anything about it. And so his kids we're faced with a hypocritical dad. Oh, this is so terrible, but I'm making money here, so we're going to stay. Oh, this is terrible, but girls go out and get raped because he was a mess. He did not follow his own compass, and he messed up his girls, I think, more than the world around them. I won't spend time on this, but in 1 Corinthians, Paul says this in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, I've written you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. Not at all, meaning the people of this world who are immoral or greedy or swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you'd have to leave the world. In other words, Paul is saying, look, you know what? There's a lot of bad influences out there, but you can't leave them because the only way to not ever run into people like this is to leave the world. That's the only way. But, he says, here's something you should avoid. And the next verse, but now I'm writing you that you must not associate with anyone who calls himself a brother, but is all of those things. What's the key there? It's not just the things, it's the hypocrisy. What do you expect from the unbelieving world? They're going to act like the unbelieving world. But when the Christians act like the unbelieving world, that will ruin a compass. That's the hill that twists the compass and makes the kid eventually throw it away. This thing is worthless. I'm going to make my own way. Mom and Dad have been lying to me. Or either they're lying to me or they don't believe it either. Mom and Dad, calibrate your compass. Be willing to course correct. Let your kids see it. That will help them. Last thing, last tip. Pray that they would see clearly and choose wisely. Colossians 1:9, for this reason, since the day we heard about you, we have not stopped praying for you. I want to end with just a quick story about this with me. I've made many, many mistakes as a father, many. My oldest girl, the one that followed me through the woods and watched me argue with my compass, got to a point in her life where she was needing to navigate the world. And as parents, sometimes I think we wish we could just make it so they don't have to struggle with this. But the truth is, at some point, you turn your kids loose into the woods. At some point, your kids are going to leave the pickup truck and they're going to go into the woods and you're not going to be with them. And at that point, they have to make decisions. Am I going to believe my map? Am I going to follow my compass? And you have to let them go to do it. And so you pray. You pray, Lord, help them to see clearly that there's a difference between the world and you. Help them to see that difference and then help them to choose wisely. I pray they'd choose you. My oldest daughter, and she would tell you this, my oldest daughter got to a point in her life where she was having to make those decisions herself. And there was a question how she was going to choose. There was a real question what she was going to choose. As she set out into the world on her own, she was deciding whether I'm going to follow this map, whether I'm going to follow this compass, or if I'm going to chart my own course. I had made thousands of mistakes with my kids, and it was painful for me to have to step back and realize now I just pray for her. And I prayed that prayer. It's gone. I prayed it so much. Lord, I pray she'd see clearly and choose wisely. And I would just pray. Because I'd told her, I'd been telling her for years. She didn't want to hear it anymore. She knew what I was going to say. She could tell it to me. Yeah, Dad, I could write down what you're going to tell me. I know what you're going to tell me. You're right, darling, you know. And so I prayed. And I didn't know where she was going, and at times it looked like she was going the wrong direction. In the middle of that time, before she chose to turn back, and she did. She did. She finally saw, maybe she saw the whole time that there was a difference between God and the world, and she finally decided, I don't want that, Lord. I'm going to choose you. And she did, and she is running with the Lord. But before she did that, she gave me this. And it said, I'm going to cry. It says, Daddy, in your eyes, I've seen God's love. In your words, I've heard his wisdom. And through your life, I've found his grace. And she wrote me this note when she gave it to me. She says, Daddy, this gift isn't anything spectacular, and I didn't even come up with the idea. But when I read this wall hanging, I knew I had to make it for you. I mean the words written on this canvas from the bottom of my heart. I'm so lucky that God decided to have you be my dad. And despite all the mistakes I made as a father, she saw the difference between God and the world, and she chose wisely. And I think it had as much to do with my prayers as it did with anything else, because I finally gave up and said, God, she's yours more than she's mine. You take her. Mom and Dad, this is a big deal. I would encourage you to think of this, pray. Let's pray. Lord, I just thank you that you, Lord, are good to us. You're good to our kids. I just pray, Father, that we would learn from this lesson of Lot and his daughters. And to whatever degree, Lord, we have influence with the children around us, help us to help them. I pray that we would be helped by you. We would see where we're going. We would let you calibrate our own moral compass and help us to be an example to the kids around us. We ask this, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen.